A sealed pack of Kool cigarettes lying on the jungle floor. An American sergeant reaches for it. His Australian ally screams the warning. Too late. 3 men gone in a flash of shrapnel. And here is the most terrifying part. The Australians had walked past that same pack 3 times already. They knew something the Americans refused to learn. What did the Australian SAS know that the Pentagon kept classified for decades? Why did 550 Australian operators achieve results that 500,000 American troops could not replicate? And why did American commanders bury the reports that could have saved thousands of their own men? Today, we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most suppressed rivalries in military history, the story they never wanted you to hear. Australian special forces with a kill ratio so impossible that Pentagon analysts accused them of fabricating numbers. Methods so controversial that American Green Berets requested immediate transfer after witnessing them, and a simple 4-word warning that American soldiers kept ignoring to their graves. Touch nothing or face the consequences. This is not Hollywood fiction. This is documented history that military institutions on 2 continents have tried to forget. You will learn why Aboriginal tracking techniques outperformed billion-dollar American surveillance technology. You will discover the psychological warfare methods that made enemy soldiers believe the Australians were supernatural beings. And you will understand why the lessons written in American blood were filed away and ignored. Stay until the end. Because the final revelation about what happened to those classified reports will change how you think about military pride, institutional arrogance, and the true cost of refusing to learn from those who know better. This is the story they tried to bury. Let us dig it up. The American sergeant reached for the cigarette pack lying on the jungle floor. It was a Kool menthol, still sealed in cellophane, glinting in the morning light that filtered through the triple canopy. His Australian counterpart screamed the warning a fraction of a second too late. The explosion tore through the patrol, sending 3 men to their graves and leaving 2 others maimed for life. That cigarette pack had been placed there 72 hours earlier by Vietnamese sappers who knew exactly what American soldiers could not resist. The Australians had walked past it 3 times already. They knew better. They always knew better. But this was only the first tragedy in a long catalog of preventable losses. This was Vietnam in 1968, and the lessons written in blood that morning would echo through 5 decades of special operations history. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had developed an almost supernatural understanding of the enemy's mind. They knew that the Viet Cong studied American habits with the patience of doctoral researchers. They knew that every abandoned item in the jungle was a question waiting to be answered with shrapnel, and they knew that their American allies, despite all their firepower and technological superiority, kept making the same fatal mistakes. And yet, the real shock was still waiting in classified files that Pentagon officials hoped would never see daylight. This story is not simply about booby traps and battlefield awareness. This is the chronicle of how one small nation's elite warriors developed methods so effective, so psychologically devastating, and so controversial that the Pentagon classified their findings for decades. This is the account of men who turned the Vietnamese jungle into their hunting ground while American units struggled to survive their first month in country. This is the tale of a rivalry that the official histories never mention, a competence gap that military pride refused to acknowledge, and lessons paid for in blood that modern special forces still study in classified briefings. The Australian SAS arrived in Vietnam with 550 men, total over the entire course of the war. They left behind a legacy that haunts military academies to this day. Their kill ratio defied statistical probability. Their casualty rates made Pentagon analysts suspect the numbers were fabricated. Their methods made hardened American Green Berets request immediate transfer, and their warning about touching nothing in the jungle became the most ignored piece of advice in the entire conflict. But before we understand why Americans ignored that warning, we must first understand the men who gave it. The first Australian SAS squadron touched down at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province during July of 1966. They came from a different world, these men from the land down under. Many had grown up hunting kangaroos in the outback, tracking feral pigs through scrubland that would eliminate an unprepared man in 48 hours. Some had Aboriginal blood in their veins, carrying genetic memory of a hunting tradition spanning 60,000 years. All of them had completed selection courses that made the British SAS program look like a holiday camp. Their commanding officers had studied the American experience with clinical detachment for 2 full years before committing troops. What they observed disturbed them deeply. American units were being ambushed with alarming regularity. Patrols were loud, predictable, and dependent on artillery support that announced their presence for miles in every direction. The body count strategy demanded aggressive contact, which meant American soldiers were essentially advertising their locations to an enemy who had been fighting in these jungles for generations. The Australians decided to do everything differently, and that decision would create friction with their American allies that persists in special operations communities to this very day. But the true test came when American liaison officers first accompanied Australian patrols into the bush. What they witnessed would shatter everything they believed about modern warfare. Captain William Henderson arrived at Nui Dat in March of 1967 as part of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Intelligence Exchange Program. His mission was straightforward enough on paper. Observe Australian SAS methods, document their tactics, and report back to MACV headquarters in Saigon. Henderson had served 2 tours with the Green Berets, earned his combat infantryman badge in the Central Highlands, and considered himself an expert in unconventional warfare. His first patrol with the Australians destroyed that confidence within 72 hours. The preparation phase alone bewildered him. Australian operators spent 3 full days studying aerial photographs of their patrol area, memorizing every stream crossing, every trail junction, every potential ambush site. They quizzed each other on escape routes and rally points until the information was burned into muscle memory. American patrols typically received their mission briefings hours before departure. The Australians treated every operation like a final exam with lethal consequences for wrong answers. And this obsessive preparation was merely the beginning of Henderson's education. Then came the equipment inspection. Henderson watched as the patrol commander physically examined every piece of gear his men carried. Loose buckles were taped, metal surfaces were dulled with mud, canteens were filled precisely to eliminate sloshing sounds. One operator had to repack his rucksack 3 times because the contents shifted when he moved. In American units, such attention to noise discipline was considered excessive. Among the Australian SAS, it was the minimum acceptable standard. The patrol stepped off into the jungle at last light, and Henderson entered a world he had never imagined possible. These men moved through the densest vegetation without making a single audible sound. They communicated entirely through hand signals and touch. When they stopped for rest, they formed a defensive position so tight that each man could reach out and touch 2 others. No one spoke. No one smoked. No one so much as coughed for 10 consecutive days. But what happened on the 3rd night would haunt Henderson for the rest of his career. Henderson had conducted dozens of patrols with American units. Those operations featured regular radio checks, meal breaks with heated rations, and occasional cigarette stops that the VC could smell from half a kilometer away. The Australians ate cold rations crushed into powder that could be consumed without chewing. They defecated into plastic bags that were carried until extraction. They urinated into bottles. Every trace of their presence was eliminated or contained. And then there was the matter of the objects they encountered in the jungle. This was where Henderson nearly became another statistic in the long catalog of American booby trap casualties. 72 hours into the patrol, Henderson spotted a North Vietnamese Army pistol belt lying across a fallen log. It was exactly the kind of war trophy that American soldiers collected obsessively. He reached for it without thinking. The Australian patrol commander materialized from the undergrowth like an apparition and slapped his hand away with such force that Henderson thought his wrist might be broken. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The look in that man's eyes communicated everything. That pistol belt was death waiting for a curious hand. But the briefing that followed revealed horrors that Henderson had never contemplated. Later, back at base, the commander explained what Henderson had nearly touched. The Viet Cong had perfected the art of turning American desires into lethal traps. They knew that American soldiers collected souvenirs compulsively: pistol belts, pith helmets, flags, weapons, canteens, even personal photographs. Every single one of these items could be rigged with pressure release triggers, tripwires, or delayed fuses. The Vietnamese had studied American psychology with devastating accuracy, but here was the truly disturbing part of the briefing. The Australians had documented over 200 separate booby trap designs employed by the enemy. Some were obvious, crude affairs that any trained soldier should recognize. Others were so sophisticated that they could fool explosive ordnance disposal experts. The Vietnamese would sometimes place an obvious trap to draw attention away from a concealed secondary device. They would bury charges along the escape routes that panicked soldiers would naturally use after triggering the first explosion. They would leave wounded animals as bait, knowing that Americans would approach to deliver a mercy shot and step on pressure plates hidden beneath the carcass. And the enemy's creativity was evolving faster than American countermeasures could adapt. The Australians survived because they operated on a simple principle: touch nothing. Assume everything is a trap. If an object seems out of place, it exists to attract attention and end lives. This philosophy ran directly counter to the American emphasis on material intelligence collection, which valued captured documents and equipment as sources of operational information. Henderson would later document this fundamental conflict in his classified report to Massiv. The Americans were fighting a war of acquisition, the Australians were fighting a war of survival, and the jungle floor was littered with evidence of who was winning. But the statistics that emerged from Phuoc Tuy Province would prove even more damning than Henderson's field observations. The numbers that emerged from Australian operations would haunt Pentagon analysts for years. The figures simply did not make sense according to any conventional military calculus. The Australian SAS suffered a total of 2 personnel lost to direct enemy action during the entire Vietnam deployment. Not 200, not 20. 2. Meanwhile, their confirmed elimination count exceeded 500 enemy combatants. This produced a ratio that American units could not approach even with unlimited air support, artillery coverage, and numerical superiority. How was this possible? The question consumed military intelligence professionals on 3 continents, and the answer would challenge everything Americans believed about winning wars. Part of the answer lay in the Australian approach to contact with the enemy. American doctrine emphasized aggressive pursuit and destruction of enemy forces through superior firepower. When an American patrol encountered the Viet Cong, the standard response was to fix the enemy in place and call for airstrikes, artillery, or reinforcements. This approach worked brilliantly in conventional warfare. Against guerrillas who could disappear into tunnel systems and underground hospitals, it produced impressive body counts, but rarely strategic results. The Australians inverted this entire logic. Their patrols actively avoided contact whenever possible. They spent their time observing enemy movements, mapping supply routes, and identifying high-value targets. When they did engage, the engagement was brief, devastating, and terminated before the enemy could mount a coherent response. An Australian ambush typically lasted less than 30 seconds. In that half-minute of controlled violence, every round found its target. Then the patrol vanished back into the jungle like smoke dissolving in rain. But American observers initially dismissed these methods as cowardice. They would soon learn otherwise. American observers found this approach almost cowardly at first. Real soldiers closed with the enemy and destroyed them. Real soldiers did not spend 10 days crawling through the bush just to observe a trail junction. Real soldiers did not abort missions because conditions favored the enemy rather than themselves. But the casualty reports told a different story, and eventually, some Americans began to listen. The problem was that listening came too late for thousands of men who might have survived if institutional pride had not blocked the transfer of knowledge. The rivalry between American and Australian Special Operations Forces reached its peak during the 1968 Tet Offensive. As communist forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, both nations' elite units found themselves operating in the same areas of operations with conflicting doctrines and simmering professional jealousy. And it was during this chaos that a single incident would expose the fundamental incompatibility of American and Australian approaches. An incident near the village of Long Con in February of that year illustrates the tension with brutal clarity. An American MACV-SOG team had been tracking a North Vietnamese Army regiment moving through the province. They planned a conventional ambush using claymore mines and automatic weapons fire, supported by helicopter gunships on standby. The operation was textbook American doctrine, designed to maximize enemy casualties through overwhelming firepower. The Australian SAS patrol operating in the same area had been observing that identical NVA regiment for 6 days already. They had mapped its command structure, identified the regimental commander's location in the march formation, and determined the precise moment when the unit was most vulnerable. Their plan called for a single sniper shot to eliminate the commander, followed by immediate exfiltration while the regiment dissolved into confusion and paranoid recrimination. But neither patrol knew the other existed, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The two Allied patrols were not aware of each other's presence until the Americans triggered their ambush 45 minutes before the Australians' planned action. The firefight that erupted eliminated approximately 60 NVA soldiers, but also alerted the regimental commander, who escaped into a tunnel complex. The regiment scattered but reformed within 72 hours under new leadership and continued its march toward Saigon. The Australian Patrol Commander's after-action report contained language that MACV intelligence officers found deeply offensive. He described the American operation as tactically successful but strategically worthless. Eliminating 60 soldiers while allowing the command structure to survive meant that the NVA simply replaced their losses and continued operations. His sniper shot would have eliminated a commander whose replacement required months of evaluation and promotion decisions. One round would have achieved what 60 bodies could not. This report was classified and buried in MACV archives. Its conclusions were too damaging to the institutional pride of American special operations to ever see daylight. But the tactical disagreements were nothing compared to the controversy that erupted over Australian psychological warfare methods. The Australians understood something that American strategists refused to acknowledge. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army were not simply military organizations. They were political movements with extensive infrastructure in the civilian population. Eliminating individual soldiers accomplished nothing if the recruitment and support networks remained intact. The war would only end when the enemy's will to fight was broken at the psychological level. To achieve this psychological fracture, the Australian SAS employed methods that violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Geneva Conventions. And the most notorious of these methods became known as the talking dead. What American observers witnessed next would give them nightmares for decades. When an Australian patrol eliminated a confirmed Viet Cong cadre or NVA officer, they would sometimes leave the body in a carefully staged position. The corpse would be arranged sitting upright against a tree, eyes open, with a playing card or unit patch placed in its hand. Sometimes a note would be pinned to the chest with a message in Vietnamese. The ghost soldiers see everything. The Ma Rung is watching. Your name is on our list. The psychological impact on surviving enemy forces was devastating. Viet Cong units that encountered these displays reported to their political officers that the Australians possessed supernatural powers. Rumors spread through enemy ranks that the SAS could appear and disappear at will, that they could see in total darkness, that they were not fully human. Desertion rates in Phuoc Tuy Province exceeded any other area of operations in South Vietnam. But the Americans were not prepared to accept methods that challenged their understanding of civilized warfare. American commanders were horrified when they learned of these practices. The desecration of enemy remains violated core principles of American military culture. It provided propaganda ammunition to the communist cause. It crossed ethical lines that professional soldiers were supposed to respect. But the Australians posed a question that had no comfortable answer. If these methods saved Allied lives by convincing enemy soldiers to desert or surrender, did the ethical calculus change? If arranging a corpse as a warning message prevented a battalion from entering a province, was that not preferable to eliminating every man in that battalion through conventional combat? The ends and means problem had no clean solution, and the debate continues in special operations communities to this day. And yet the psychological warfare was only one element of Australian superiority. Their tracking capabilities defied modern comprehension entirely. The integration of Aboriginal tracking techniques into Australian SAS operations represented another dimension of their controversial effectiveness. And this element, more than any other, baffled American observers who prided themselves on technological superiority. The Australian Army had employed Aboriginal trackers since the 19th century colonial conflicts. These men possessed skills that seemed almost magical to observers unfamiliar with traditional hunting cultures. They could read disturbances in vegetation that indicated human passage hours or even days earlier. They could estimate the number of people in a group by examining the depth and spacing of footprints. They could determine whether individuals were carrying heavy loads, moving under stress, or injured, all from marks in the soil that untrained eyes could not even perceive. But what these trackers achieved in Vietnam would make even their ancestors' skills seem ordinary. When the SAS deployed to Vietnam, several operators of Aboriginal heritage brought these ancestral skills into the modern battlefield. Others learned tracking techniques during the brutal selection and training process. The result was patrols that could follow enemy movements across terrain that American units considered impassable. A declassified after-action report from November of 1967 describes an Australian patrol tracking a Viet Cong supply team for 11 consecutive days through triple canopy jungle. The VC team was using every counter-tracking technique in their considerable repertoire. They walked in streams, crossed their own trails, split into smaller groups, and backtracked repeatedly. An American pursuit operation would have lost the trail within the first 24 hours. The Australian lead tracker followed scuff marks on underwater stones, bent twigs that were just beginning to recover their original positions, and subtle differences in the decay rate of disturbed leaf litter. When the patrol finally caught up with the supply team at their cache site, the ambush lasted precisely 12 seconds. 7 enemy combatants transitioned from life to whatever comes after. The supplies included documents that revealed 3 previously unknown tunnel complexes in the province. But American military leadership refused to believe that ancient techniques could outperform modern technology. American liaison officers who witnessed such operations struggled to incorporate what they had seen into their understanding of modern warfare. The United States military was investing billions of dollars in electronic sensors, airborne surveillance platforms, and computer-assisted intelligence analysis. Meanwhile, a handful of Australians were achieving superior results using techniques older than agriculture itself. The equipment adaptations developed by Australian SAS operators in Vietnam became a catalog of practical innovation that American forces would eventually adopt, often years after the techniques had been proven in combat. But the story of how these innovations were rejected reveals the true cost of institutional arrogance. Take the matter of footwear modification. Australian operators discovered that the distinctive sole pattern of standard military boots left tracks that enemy trackers could identify immediately. The Viet Cong knew exactly what American and ARVN boot prints looked like, and they used this knowledge to track patrols and prepare ambushes. The Australian solution was characteristically direct. They acquired sandals made from old truck tires. the standard footwear of Vietnamese peasants and Viet Cong fighters alike. Some operators modified their own boots by slicing sections from the sole and heel to create an irregular pattern that could not be easily categorized. Others wore their boots backwards, creating tracks that appeared to show movement in the opposite direction. And this simple innovation probably saved more lives than millions of dollars worth of American technology. This technique alone probably saved dozens of lives over the course of the deployment. But when Australian advisors suggested that American units adopt similar practices, the proposal was rejected by supply chain officials who insisted that non-standard footwear could not be issued through proper channels. Similar resistance met Australian innovations in ration consumption, water purification, medical self-treatment, and communication protocols. The American military machine was optimized for standardization and mass production. Individual modifications that worked brilliantly for small elite units could not be scaled to an army of 500,000 personnel. The tragedy was that this institutional inflexibility cost lives that proper adaptation could have saved, but the intelligence failures ran even deeper than equipment standardization problems. The intelligence gathered by Australian SAS patrols provided some of the most valuable operational information of the entire war. And the story of how this intelligence was collected reveals the fundamental difference between quantity and quality in covert operations. American reconnaissance units typically operated on short-duration missions with specific objectives. Locate the enemy, fix his position, call in airstrikes or ground forces, extract before nightfall. This approach generated enormous amounts of actionable intelligence but sacrificed depth for breadth. American commanders knew where the enemy was at any given moment. They rarely understood why he was there or where he was going next. Australian patrols inverted this priority in ways that changed everything. Australian patrols inverted this priority. A standard SAS reconnaissance mission lasted between 14 and 21 days. During this extended period, the patrol would establish multiple observation posts overlooking enemy supply routes, base camps, or infiltration corridors. They would watch the same locations for days at a time, building pattern analysis that revealed far more than any single snapshot could provide. This approach allowed the Australians to identify command and control nodes, logistical choke points, and communication networks that remained invisible to conventional reconnaissance. A patrol might spend a week watching a trail junction, documenting every unit that passed through, noting the timing of movements and the composition of forces. When that information was analyzed back at headquarters, it revealed the enemy's operational rhythm in ways that no amount of short-term surveillance could match. The Americans called this approach slow and inefficient. The Australians called it effective. The casualty reports suggested which assessment was more accurate. But survival in the jungle came at a psychological price that no one discussed openly. The story of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam cannot be understood without examining the psychological transformation that these men underwent during their deployments. And here the narrative enters territory that even veterans themselves struggle to articulate. The jungle changes people. This is not metaphor or melodrama. Prolonged exposure to an environment where death waits in every shadow, where the enemy could be anywhere, where survival depends on constant hypervigilance, these conditions rewire the human nervous system in measurable ways. The Australians who emerged from the bush after their standard 12-month deployments were not the same men who had entered, and the changes they experienced went far beyond normal combat stress. They developed sensory capabilities that seemed impossible to those who had not experienced similar conditions. Veterans reported being able to smell Vietnamese tobacco smoke from hundreds of meters away. They could detect the presence of humans by subtle changes in insect sounds or bird behavior. They learned to sleep while remaining partially alert to environmental changes, a trick that took months to unlearn after returning to civilian life. Some adaptations were purely psychological. The men learned to suppress emotional responses that interfered with mission effectiveness. Fear, anger, disgust, remorse. These reactions were liabilities in combat that could get entire patrols eliminated. Operators developed what psychologists would later call emotional compartmentalization, the ability to set aside feelings until a safer time for processing. But for many of these warriors, that safer time would never arrive. The problem was that many of these men never found that safer time. The emotional debts accumulated in the Vietnamese jungle came due years or decades later, with compound interest. The Australian veterans community documented rates of post-traumatic stress, substance abuse, and self-termination that exceeded any other service arm. The skills that made them lethal in combat made them aliens in peacetime society. This human cost is often omitted from discussions of tactical effectiveness. It should not be. Every capability has a price, and the price paid by these operators was denominated in lifetimes of psychological damage. Meanwhile, the booby trap problem continued to claim American lives at an appalling rate. The booby trap awareness program that the Australian SAS developed became the most comprehensive catalog of enemy denial tactics ever assembled by any force in the Vietnam conflict. And the story of its creation reveals both the brilliance of Australian methodology and the stubborn resistance of American institutional pride. The program began with a simple recognition. Every booby trap told a story. The device itself was merely the final chapter. The preceding chapters included reconnaissance, planning, construction, placement, and camouflage. If you could read the entire story rather than just the explosive conclusion, you could predict where traps would be placed before you encountered them, and the patterns they discovered would have saved thousands of American lives if anyone had listened. Australian intelligence officers began systematically debriefing every patrol about every trap they encountered or suspected. They photographed trigger mechanisms, documented placement patterns, and interviewed captured enemy sappers about their training and techniques. Over time, this information accumulated into a predictive model of enemy denial operations. The model revealed patterns that seemed obvious in retrospect, but had escaped American analysis. Traps were disproportionately placed along logical approach routes that Western military thinking would favor. Elevated ground, defensive positions, water sources, the locations that European tactical doctrine identified as valuable were precisely the locations most likely to be mined or booby-trapped. Furthermore, the enemy used what the Australians called attractors, objects or features designed to draw attention and lure the curious into killing zones. The Kool cigarette pack that eliminated 3 American soldiers at the beginning of this narrative was a textbook attractor. So were enemy weapons, documents, photographs of family members, personal items that appealed to the souvenir collecting instinct of American troops. But when the Australians tried to share this knowledge, they encountered a wall of American arrogance. The Australian response was total prohibition. Touch nothing that you did not bring into the jungle yourself. If you must recover documents or equipment, assume they are trapped until proven otherwise through careful technical examination. If in doubt, leave it. No piece of intelligence is worth a human life. When Australian advisors presented this doctrine to American commanders, the reception was skeptical at best. American intelligence collection depended heavily on captured materials. Telling troops to leave enemy documents in place contradicted fundamental collection priorities. The suggestion that American soldiers were somehow more vulnerable to attractor traps than their Australian counterparts was taken as an insult to U.S. military professionalism. The objections were noted. The traps continued to claim victims. The lessons remained unlearned until long after the war had ended. And then came the Phoenix program, where the ethical boundaries blurred beyond recognition. The 1969 Phoenix program coordination between Australian SAS and American intelligence agencies represents one of the most controversial chapters in this already controversial history. And the details, even those that have been declassified, suggest operations that challenged every conventional understanding of legitimate military activity. Phoenix was an American-led initiative designed to neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure. the political organization that supported communist military operations in South Vietnam. The program employed a range of methods from simple intelligence collection to targeted termination of identified VCI members. Its legal status, ethical justification, and ultimate effectiveness remain hotly debated half a century after its conclusion. But Australian involvement went deeper than official records acknowledge. Australian SAS participation in Phoenix-related operations has never been fully acknowledged by the Australian government. Veterans have provided fragmentary accounts that suggest deep involvement in what would today be called targeted elimination operations. These accounts describe missions against specific individuals identified by intelligence analysis as critical nodes in the VCI network. The ethics of such operations exist in a gray zone that military philosophers continue to debate. Eliminating a political operative who recruits fighters, organizes logistics, and plans attacks on civilian targets is not the same as engaging uniformed soldiers on a battlefield. But neither is it clearly distinguishable from assassination, a practice that supposedly civilized nations have historically condemned. The Australians who conducted these operations offer no apologies and few explanations. Their view is pragmatic to the point of clinical detachment. The individuals they targeted were enemy combatants by any reasonable definition. The fact that these combatants wore civilian clothes and carried documents rather than rifles did not change their fundamental function in the enemy's war machine. Eliminating them was legitimate military action, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth made politicians and ethicists. American participants in Phoenix often suffered severe psychological consequences from their involvement. The Australian operators, generally speaking, did not. Whether this reflects superior psychological preparation, cultural differences in processing violence, or some other factor remains unclear. But the greatest tragedy was not what happened during the war. It was what failed to happen afterward. The transfer of knowledge from Australian SAS to American Special Operations Forces during and after Vietnam followed a tortuous path that institutional pride repeatedly blocked. The formal mechanisms for Allied intelligence sharing should have facilitated smooth exchange of tactical innovations. In practice, what occurred was closer to institutional sabotage. American officers who returned from exchange assignments with Australian units and attempted to implement what they had learned frequently encountered career-damaging resistance. A lieutenant colonel who proposed adopting Australian patrol duration standards was told that American soldiers could not be expected to operate under such austere conditions. A major who advocated for Aboriginal-derived tracking training was informed that such primitive techniques had no place in a modern military. A captain who suggested modifying boot soles to confuse enemy trackers was denied supply authorization for non-standard equipment. And so the lessons paid for in blood were filed away and forgotten. The pattern repeated across dozens of specific recommendations. American military culture in the Vietnam era was profoundly resistant to the suggestion that any foreign force might do something better than U.S. units. This resistance was not conspiracy. It was simply the natural response of large institutions to uncomfortable information that challenged core assumptions about their own excellence. Some knowledge did transfer despite institutional obstacles. Special Forces operators who had served alongside Australians brought techniques back to their home units through informal channels. Training programs incorporated some Australian methods without crediting their origin. Equipment modifications spread through the special operations community by word of mouth rather than official doctrine. But the comprehensive integration of Australian lessons learned never occurred during the Vietnam conflict itself. That failure cost lives, an uncountable number of lives, across the remaining years of the war. The withdrawal changed everything and nothing. The withdrawal of Australian forces from Vietnam in 1971 allowed the SAS to consolidate lessons that would shape Australian special operations for generations. But it also closed a chapter that the military establishments of both nations preferred to forget. The final casualty accounting tells a story that statisticians still struggle to explain. Over the entire deployment, Australian SAS lost a total of 2 operators to enemy action. They suffered additional casualties from accidents, illness, and friendly fire incidents, but direct enemy contact resulted in only 2 fatalities. Their confirmed elimination count exceeded 500 enemy combatants, with many more categorized as probable based on blood trails and other evidence. American Special Operations units operating in the same time period and similar terrain suffered casualty rates at least an order of magnitude higher. MACVSOG teams, generally considered the elite of American unconventional forces in Vietnam, experienced loss rates that sometimes exceeded 50% on specific operations. But the question that haunted analysts was simple. Why? The disparity cannot be attributed to any single factor. Australian selection and training processes were more demanding. Their tactical doctrine prioritized survival over contact. Their cultural background included relevant skills in tracking and bush survival. Their smaller organizational footprint allowed tighter operational security. All of these factors contributed to outcomes that still generate professional jealousy and uncomfortable questions. But perhaps the most significant factor was attitude. The Australians entered Vietnam expecting a difficult, dangerous fight against a capable enemy. They prepared accordingly. American units too often arrived with confidence in their technological and firepower advantages, confidence that the enemy systematically exploited. Touch nothing or cease to exist. The warning encapsulated an entire philosophy of humility before the jungle, respect for enemy capabilities, and discipline in the face of temptation. Those who heeded it survived. Those who did not fill graves in military cemeteries across the United States. And the legacy of that warning extends far beyond Vietnam. The legacy of Australian SAS Vietnam operations extends far beyond the immediate conflict and continues to influence special operations doctrine to this day. Modern Tier 1 units across multiple nations now employ patrol techniques that can be traced directly to Australian innovations in the Vietnamese jungle. Extended duration reconnaissance, meticulous noise discipline, tracking and counter-tracking procedures, psychological operations against enemy morale. These capabilities all bear the fingerprints of lessons learned in Phuoc Tuy Province. But the transfer was neither smooth nor complete. Much valuable knowledge remained locked in the memories of aging veterans rather than incorporated into formal training curricula. Institutional resistance prevented adoption of techniques that challenged comfortable assumptions. National pride blocked acknowledgement of foreign superiority in specific tactical areas. And the missed opportunities continue to haunt those who understand what might have been. The missed opportunities haunt military historians who study the period. How many American lives might have been saved if the Booby trap awareness program had been fully implemented? How many operations might have succeeded if Australian reconnaissance methods had been adopted? How many enemy commanders might have been eliminated if targeted operations had replaced indiscriminate firepower as the primary approach? These questions have no definitive answers. They serve only to illuminate the costs of institutional stubbornness and misplaced confidence. The veterans of Australian SAS Vietnam operations live today in diminishing numbers, scattered across a continent that largely forgot their service. Some wrote memoirs that revealed details the government preferred to keep classified. Others maintained silence about experiences that resist ordinary language. Most occupy that uncomfortable space between pride in their service and awareness of its moral complexities. But one question remains unanswered even after 5 decades. The booby trap victims among American forces who ignored Australian warnings have no voice in this narrative. They cannot speak to what they learned in the moment between reaching for that cigarette pack, that pistol belt, that enemy flag, and the detonation that ended their stories. But their silence teaches its own lesson about the price of overconfidence and the value of heeding hard-won wisdom from those who understand the enemy better than you do. Touch nothing. Assume everything is a trap. The jungle is not your environment. The enemy has been here longer and knows it better. Your technology and firepower mean nothing if you are eliminated before you can employ them. These truths were purchased with blood by Australian operators who learned them through methods their American allies could not stomach and institutional cultures could not accept. The classified reports that Captain William Henderson filed tell the final chapter of this story. The classified reports that Captain William Henderson filed after his exchange assignment with Australian SAS circulated through American military intelligence for years without generating meaningful change. His warnings about booby trap vulnerabilities went unheeded. His recommendations for extended patrol durations were rejected as impractical. His documentation of Australian psychological warfare methods was buried under classification stamps that ensured no journalist or historian would ever expose what he had witnessed. Henderson himself left military service in 1972, disillusioned with an institution that refused to learn from its mistakes. He spent his remaining years operating a hardware store in rural Pennsylvania, rarely speaking about his time in Vietnam. When he passed in 2014, his papers included the original copies of reports that the military had supposedly destroyed. His family donated them to a university archive where they remain, still partially redacted, waiting for scholars who understand their significance. The story those reports tell is not comfortable for American military pride. They document an Allied force that consistently outperformed U.S. Special Operations by metrics that matter most in guerrilla warfare. They reveal institutional arrogance that cost American lives and extended the conflict. They expose methods that violated ethical standards while achieving results that conventional approaches could not match. And they contain, repeated across dozens of pages in Henderson's methodical handwriting, the same warning that opens this narrative. Touch nothing. The Australians have learned something we refuse to accept. The enemy knows us better than we know ourselves. The psychological warfare techniques that disturbed Henderson and his American colleagues eventually found their way into special operations doctrine through indirect channels, modern targeting of enemy leadership, information operations designed to fracture morale, precision elimination of command and control nodes. All of these capabilities evolved from the crude but effective methods pioneered in the Vietnamese jungle. But the ethical questions Henderson raised have never been resolved. The ethical debates never reached satisfactory resolution. Military professionals still argue about whether displaying enemy remains to demoralize their comrades crosses lines that should not be crossed. The utilitarian calculation remains uncomfortable. If terrorizing 10 men convinces them to desert, have you saved 10 lives or committed 10 crimes? Australian veterans generally decline to engage with such philosophical inquiries. They did what worked. They survived when survival seemed impossible. They accomplished missions that their American counterparts could not replicate despite vastly superior resources. The moral accounting can be left to academics who never had to decide, in the split second between trigger pull and detonation, whether the man in their sights was a legitimate target or a protected civilian. And the Aboriginal techniques they employed raise even more uncomfortable questions about what modern militaries have forgotten. The integration of Aboriginal heritage into Australian SAS operations raises questions about military adaptation that extend far beyond the Vietnam context. Indigenous knowledge systems developed over tens of thousands of years contain capabilities that modern technology struggles to replicate. Tracking, navigation, environmental awareness, survival techniques. These skills exist in cultural traditions that Western military establishments have historically dismissed as primitive. The Australians demonstrated that such dismissal was strategically foolish. Operators who could read the jungle like their ancestors read the outback possessed advantages that no amount of electronic surveillance could provide. They moved through the green hell as predators rather than prey, understanding the environment as an ally rather than an obstacle. This lesson has been selectively absorbed by modern special operations. Tracking schools now teach techniques derived from indigenous hunting traditions. Survival training incorporates knowledge from cultures that lived in harsh environments without technological assistance. But the deeper integration that Australian SAS achieved in Vietnam remains rare, perhaps because it requires cultural humility that military institutions find difficult to sustain. But the fundamental question still demands an answer. Why did Americans keep reaching for those cigarette packs? The question of why American forces consistently underestimated enemy booby trap capabilities deserves deeper examination. The answer reveals something profound about the psychology of technological superiority and its limitations. American military doctrine in the Vietnam era assumed that technical advantage translated directly into battlefield dominance. Better weapons, better communications, better medical support, better logistics. Surely these factors would overwhelm any enemy regardless of their familiarity with the terrain. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong in the guerrilla context. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army learned to neutralize American technological advantages through adaptation, concealment, and psychological manipulation. They could not match American firepower, so they avoided situations where firepower could be employed. They could not match American mobility, so they created obstacles that slowed movement to a crawl. They could not match American resources, so they exploited American abundance through traps that turned every piece of desirable equipment into potential death. And in the end, the simplest trap of all was the most effective. The booby trap is, in essence, a weapon that uses the enemy's psychology against him. It requires understanding what your opponent wants, what will attract his attention, what he cannot resist touching despite knowing better. The Vietnamese demonstrated a profound comprehension of American military psychology, a comprehension that American analysts were slow to recognize and slower to counter. The Australians succeeded where Americans struggled because they entered the conflict without assumptions of inherent superiority. They expected the enemy to be capable, adaptive, and dangerous. They prepared for the worst case, rather than the optimistic scenario. And they maintained discipline about touch nothing precisely because they took enemy booby trap capabilities seriously, rather than dismissing them as the tricks of an inferior opponent. The operational security protocols developed by Australian SAS in Vietnam established standards that elite units still struggle to maintain. The discipline required to spend 3 weeks in the jungle without making a single detectable sound demands psychological fortitude that most humans simply cannot sustain. And that discipline made the difference between life and death. Consider what such discipline requires. You cannot speak, even in whispers that might carry to enemy ears. You cannot cough, sneeze, or clear your throat without risking detection. You cannot light a fire, use a flashlight, or even check your watch if it has a luminous dial. You must control your bladder and bowels to eliminate only at designated times using noise reduction techniques. You must sleep in shifts while remaining alert enough to wake at the slightest unusual sound. And you must maintain this discipline for days and weeks on end, knowing that a single moment of carelessness could result in the elimination of your entire patrol. American units conducting similar operations in the same period rarely maintained this level of discipline for more than 72 hours. The physical and psychological strain was considered unsustainable. Patrols would return to base for rest and resupply long before their Australian counterparts even considered extraction. The difference in outcomes was measurable. Australian patrols achieved surprise in their contacts far more frequently than American units. They suffered fewer ambushes, fewer casualties, fewer mission failures. The discipline that seemed excessive to American observers proved essential to survival in an environment where the enemy's patience exceeded his firepower, but the rivalry itself was never officially acknowledged, and perhaps it never will be. The rivalry between American and Australian special operations forces that simmered throughout the Vietnam conflict never received official acknowledgement. Both nations preferred the narrative of Allied cooperation and shared sacrifice to the messier truth of tactical competition and professional jealousy. But veterans of both services know the reality. Americans who served alongside Australians returned home with complicated feelings about what they had witnessed. Some converted to Australian methods and faced institutional resistance when they tried to share what they had learned. Others rejected the comparison entirely, insisting that different conditions explain different outcomes. A few simply carried the memory of their humbling experiences in silence, unwilling to articulate what it meant to realize that their supposed superiority was illusion. Australian veterans, for their part, generally avoid triumphalism about their performance relative to American counterparts. They understand that circumstances favored their approach, that luck played a role in their survival, that different missions and different terrain would have produced different results. But they also know, with the quiet confidence of professionals who did their job well, that their methods worked when it mattered most. The healthy resolution would be honest assessment of what each force did well and poorly, integration of the most effective techniques regardless of origin, and institutional humility about the limitations of any single approach. This resolution has partially occurred over the decades since Vietnam, as special operations communities gradually absorbed lessons that should have been learned during the conflict itself. But the full reckoning has never happened, and probably never will. National pride is a powerful force. Military institutions protect their reputations with the same ferocity they apply to protecting national security. The full story of Australian SAS superiority in specific tactical domains will likely remain confined to specialist publications and veterans reunions rather than mainstream military history. And so we return to where this story began. The final lesson of this narrative returns to where it began, on the jungle floor where an American sergeant reached for a cigarette pack and found himself suddenly airborne in a cloud of shrapnel and blood. That moment encapsulates everything this story has attempted to convey. The American knew the danger. He had been briefed on booby traps. He had heard the Australian warnings about touching nothing. But in that instant, conditioning overcame training. The desire to collect a souvenir, the assumption that he could recognize a trap when he saw one, the simple human impulse to pick up an object that caught his eye, these forces proved stronger than his intellectual awareness of the risk. The Australians would have walked past that cigarette pack without a second glance. They had internalized the touch nothing doctrine so deeply that the temptation simply did not register. The object might as well have been invisible, because their training had rendered them incapable of seeing it as anything other than potential death. This difference in conditioning, in reflexive response to environmental stimuli, in the deep programming that determines what we reach for and what we avoid. This difference separated those who survived the Vietnamese jungle from those who did not. It was not a difference in courage. American soldiers were as brave as any who ever wore a military uniform. It was not a difference in patriotism, in physical capability, in technological sophistication, or in strategic vision. It was a difference in understanding. The Australians understood what the jungle was. The Americans understood only what they wished it to be. Touch nothing, or face the consequences that thousands of American soldiers faced before you. The warning echoes across 5 decades of special operations history. It whispers in the training halls where modern operators learn the hard lessons that their predecessors purchased with blood. It speaks to anyone who enters a dangerous environment, believing that their preparation is sufficient and their awareness complete. You do not know what you do not know. The enemy has studied you longer than you have studied yourself. The traps are not where you expect them. The danger is precisely in the moment when you feel most confident. Humility before the mission. Respect for enemy capabilities. Discipline in the face of temptation. These principles saved Australian lives in Vietnam. Their absence cost American lives by the thousands, and their relevance extends far beyond any specific conflict to the universal truth that overconfidence is the most lethal booby trap of all.